Welcome, everyone. I don't know if I should stand. I think I should stand and hold the mic like this. I was going to go to the podium, but I'm not going to. My name's Alan Miller. I'm one of the co-founders of the Together Association. Thank you so much for all joining us here today at this wonderful venue. It should be noted that when it was a library, in the best sense of the Industrial Revolution and the idea where I think the elite really knew who they were and also wanted the best for everyone, it was a place of learning, and Charles Dickens was the first president here. And I think it stands in stark contrast to what we see today with leadership and what they might call the elite. But anyway, we're very pleased to be at this lovely venue, and it's really fantastic that you're here, because whilst the conference has been going on for 2 days and it's been in national and international news, I think, and we think it together, one of the things that's really been missing is a debate and a thrashing out of things with the public. And that together, since the last couple of years and since our formation a year ago, we have been absolutely passionate about the idea that the public, ordinary people, you, me, us, we, have to have our voices heard much more and not be treated with contempt and not with disdain. And so it's in that context that we wanted to do the debate here this evening. I'm very pleased. We've had some of our own mini little dramas as well. So just to let you know, we did post it, but unfortunately, Bernie Spofford cannot be with us this evening. She's not got COVID. She has got a cold. But thankfully, Leslie Caton, who's on our steering group, whose birthday is... All right, so let's... happy birthday, Leslie. Is going to be reading out Bernie's speech, and we're tremendously lucky as well, fortunate, that Liam Halligan, who many of you will know from The Telegraph and from GB News, has done a real mate's good shout and come and done a solid, and he's going to come and speak to us this evening. So thank you so much to Liam. All right. So I've been told my mic's popping. I used to think I could body pop, but I'll take no, and that's... So we're not streaming this evening, so I don't have to talk to the audience out there, but we are recording. If you don't want to be recorded, don't speak later on. There is going to be an opportunity for all of you to speak and for you to say what you think and ask questions and debate. I would ask you that we do that in the spirit that we do it with together, which is you can say absolutely anything, but you do it in a civil way, and we do it in a grown-up fashion, and in a way to try and get clarity and let the antiseptic of light and reason shine on it, which we haven't seen enough of recently. So we're going to get to it. I'm going to introduce the panel, and the way it's going to work is that each of the panelists are going to speak for between 5 to 7 minutes, and I've asked them to focus on different key areas. You've all read the blurb, but the many things, the many issues that we're faced with, I want to say post-COVID, but I'm maybe a bit optimistic with that. But even if it doesn't take the form that COVID took, we're seeing many things and many trends in terms of the relationship to the public and restrictions and suffocation, free speech, and the way the institutions are working, technocratic, bureaucratic controls. And I know a lot of people have got concerns about all these things, and we want to get to the heart of it. So we're really lucky with the panel that we've got this evening. And then once they've spoken, I'm going to ask them a few questions. Then I'm going to come out to you guys and we'll do a few rounds. You'll all get to speak. So please don't heckle. We'll get you the mic and you'll all have a chance to speak and talk. So is Britain working? Well, we wanted to discuss the many challenges that we're facing today. Just to note, last year we did an event in Manchester, and this is the point. Some people say to us, supporters and friends, what are you doing all this for with MPs? What are you speaking to that lot for? You'll never get anywhere. And in some ways, I wonder if they want to be locked down perpetually, because actually what we've demonstrated in the last year, and that's all of you in the room and other people, is that we did manage to get the mandate changed. We managed to at least pause vaccine passports, although we know we've got issues with digital ID and privacy and autonomy. And it's really essential that we inculcate a spirit of what we can do and how we can put pressure on. And even though we don't have many of the MPs here, we do have a Baroness, which is great. But they do hear from us, and they know about us, and they feel the pressure, and they tell us that as well. And it's really important. It's not the only thing we do. We're not an NGO in that point of view that's just trying to lobby politicians. We're grassroots. We mobilise around the country. We've got ambassadors in the room, and we're very much of the idea that we're going to have to put as much pressure on the elected representatives with our own views as possible. So I'm not going to talk too much more, But I would ask us to think about a couple of questions, right? We've seen a lot of debate. Well, I'm not sure if it's debate, but we've seen a lot of shrill press in the last 48 hours around cuts. And we hear a lot of things about whether you're going to increase tax or decrease it. I've yet to hear a really solid discussion about productivity and what that means. And like many of the debates and discussions, sometimes it can feel like they're happening and we're a sideshow. That it's happening amongst some people, the great and the good, in a zone we can't get into. It doesn't have to be Davos. It can just be in Birmingham. And it's not to say that everyone should be in that building, but it is to say that there should be a sense that we have a relationship with constituents and the public. So, first off, we've got Rupert Lowe. And Rupert is an entrepreneur with many years of experience whose skill set spans over a range of areas. He's involved in farming and agriculture, in engineering and manufacturing. He's also been very involved in banking and the stock exchange, and actually he was chairman of Southampton Football Club as well, which is very impressive. I'm not a football fan, but I think that's very impressive. And also he was an MEP for a local constituency for a couple of years in Dudley. So he's in his neck of the woods here. And then next to Rupert, we've got Baroness Claire Fox. Claire Fox is regularly in the news. And she is also a co-founder and a director of the Academy of Ideas, which every year does a really remarkable festival called the Battle of Ideas Festival. And the next one is happening on the 15th and 16th of October in London. Together, we'll be there as well. But I'd encourage everyone to come along to it. It's really a place that I go, when I go there, and many of us from Together have gone, that you get to really meet some provocative ideas, have to argue them through, and I think we need much more of that. And Claire, you'll also know, does, I'm sure many of you will know that she does weekly reviews from the House of Lords. So that bubble that can seem a long way away, sometimes she makes it feel a bit closer, and what's going on in Westminster. So thank you, Claire, for joining us. Next, Claire, we've got Molly Kingsley. Molly Kingsley, many of you will see recently in the press because of what's happened with PayPal and Us For Them. Us For Them, one of those really inspiring organisations that's set up by three mothers who were not prepared to see children treated in certain ways. Schools closed down, young kids masked, and they were very effective in the early days. Certainly inspired me to think we actually can do something about this. And they managed to get the mask overturned in primary schools. And she's also written a book recently, co-authored it, called The Children's Inquiry, which is really important, and is also in discussions with the COVID inquiry. And really importantly, PayPal not only took them down, but also froze their account. And Molly's been very much at the head of spearheading, along with Toby Young from the Free Speech Union and ourselves are together. And I think it's another example of when all of us get together and have our voices heard on social media and everywhere, and right to our MPs and ministers, that we can begin to have an impact. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg has said it's not acceptable. That does not mean they're changing the rules, says it's not okay. But what we should do is make sure that we can make sure there's a rule to prevent discrimination against that kind of thing. So we're very pleased that Molly's here with us today. And finally, next to me, geographically on my right, I'm not sure about politically, we'll see later on, is Liam Halligan. And Liam Halligan has had a multi-decade career in journalism as an economic journalist. He's been involved at the Financial Times, Channel 4 News, even the Moscow Times. And many of you will know from him from The Telegraph, from the Sunday Telegraph, and also from Planet Normal, which he does as a podcast with Alison Pearson. Funnily enough, as I just found out again when I just spoke to Charlie up there, you meet some of the best people when you're at the bar or a pub. And I first met Liam in Brick Lane, but we are very pleased that Liam's here. And if any of you saw his piece on quantitative easing in The Telegraph, it will inform some of the discussion, I'm sure, tonight. I've certainly got some questions. I might have a couple of criticisms about it as well, but that's what tonight's all about. So please give my panellists a warm round of a welcome. And now over to you, Rupert. Thank you.
Right, well, good evening, everybody. I'm It's a long time since I've spoken. This is my old constituency of the West Midlands when I was an MEP. So I think the European Parliament was my last sort of time when I stood on my back legs and said something. I'm going to just march through what I think is quite an important, if you like, explanation of my experience of the failure of the current state that we're in. It seems like a hell of a long time ago that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher reversed many years of sclerotic socialism. I love some of the Ronald Reagan comments about government. One, I think, is, "I'm here from the government, I'm here to help." He called it the 9 most frightening words he'd ever heard. Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And the best of all, which I think he made in August '86, he said, government's view of the economy can be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. When it stops moving, subsidize it. And I think that for me sets the scene of my view of the state. So I am not a believer that the state should be large and intrusive. I like individualism, I like freedom of expression, and I like a country that respects that, which I think we used to. I'm not sure we do now. I think it's interesting to look at the growth of the UK state from the Windows tax in 1707, the beginning of income tax under Pitt the Younger in 1798 to help fund the Napoleonic Wars, Sir Robert Peel, the 2 world wars, a flirtation with socialism which conspired to result in tax rates of up to 98%. Margaret Thatcher reformed all that. She reformed the tax system. She fostered long-term investment and reduced the power of the state, resulting in wealth creation, entrepreneurism, and prosperity. Since then, taxes again increased and become unnecessarily opaque, complicated, stealthy, and dishonest. There's a need for taxation, but it requires the state to deliver value for the money that they collect from us. If it fails to do that, it's as guilty of malfeasance as any tax evader, and I mean tax evader, not tax avoider, who fails to pay their correct tax contribution. The current situation in the UK is becoming untenable, as the state, having taxed and regulated itself into every aspect of our lives, is strangling the economy, enterprise, individualism, and generally through its systemic failure, it is shutting out entrepreneurialism. Now, I'm involved in many different businesses, as Alan said, including electrical and mechanical data contracting, insurance, stockbroking, air source and ground source heat pumps, battery storage. Farming is that's my passion. I love farming. I love growing things. It's in a way my hobby. I'm interested in pharmaceuticals. I have a shareholding in a business there, and IT. I've also made many EIS investments to foster young entrepreneurial companies, and I'm the first to accept the fact that if I invest my money and it fails, I lose it. If I am successful, then I hope to make money. But I am actually acting as an entrepreneur and lubricating the economy, backing my own judgment. I'm not relying on any state handout. Now, these are the areas that we are having terrible trouble with at the moment, and I've no doubt many of you are having the same problem. Planning is completely dysfunctional. We tried, my wife's in the audience here, we tried and did apply for planning permission to use some of our redundant barns and some of our extremely marginal Cotswold brash land to build a racing stable and racing facilities for Fergal O'Brien. We've done that. It took us an inordinate amount of time. We had a lot of recidivist debate with the council and with the locals. Since we've built it, it was big investment. It's created employment in the Cotswolds. It's brought wealth. It's created Fergal O'Brien's yard, where he's had over 100 winners for the last 2 years, and I think he's on course for another 100 winners this year. So it's been incredibly good, and I think now, having fought through the planning, having spent a lot of money, we've actually now delivered something which is actually working for the community. But we shouldn't have to work that hard. It should be, they should help people to do that sort of thing. And I think if the Conservatives are going to make it work now, they've got to reform the planning system. DVLA, we've seen shortage of drivers. That's causing major problems for a lot of businesses. The passport office is always a regular offender. They can't run that. Probate, disaster. The land registry. You know, I bought some land 3 years ago. It still hasn't been registered. They charge me stamp duty, but they don't actually now process it because they're all working from home. Shotgun license. Try renewing your shotgun license. Immigration. We know it's a complete and total failure. You know, it's a huge cost to the taxpayer. In this constituency here, a lot of the hotels are full of immigrants who come in illegally. They're all being funded. It's all kept very quiet, very secret. It's not transparent, which it should be. People should be told about it, but they're not. The NHS, I'm not going to say much about them. I think they are a complete fraud, and they're in need of total reform. The original concept was good. It's become fraudulent. It doesn't deliver the service that it's supposed to be delivering, and as a result, people are dying. Agricultural subsidies. Now, this is. I have first-hand experience of this. We have different staff, you know, administering them. They change regularly. You can't get any sense out of them. You can't. They won't answer the phone. You can't get. It's absolutely hopeless. And I thought I'd just quickly read you what Clarkson, he of Diddley Squat Farm, said. I happened to pick up the Farmers Weekly. Here it is, a very fine magazine. And it was late because there was a postal strike, as you all know. He said, so this is the first piece I pick up. Prominent farmers, including Jeremy Clarkson and Gareth Wynne-Jones, have signed a letter demanding that half of all rural red tape in England is removed. The letter, which accuses the UK government of seeking to micromanage every acre, is supported by 4,725 people, including almost 2,000 farmers. It says, for years, the bureaucratic bulldozer has been trampling over the countryside, infuriating millions of us. It's cost jobs and created misery. It goes to the state. Those signing this letter would be satisfied if the rules affecting the countryside are halved before the next general election, and it doesn't hold back in its criticism of civil servants. They breed paperwork for a living, while the rest of us have real work to do, cultivating soil, looking after sick animals, and bringing in the harvest. I think, in a nutshell, that gives you the agricultural problem.
1 minute.
HMRC.
1 minute.
I've got a bit more to say. Okay, HMRC. We don't need to say anymore. COVID management. What a disaster that was. Billions wasted on PPE procurement. Lockdowns for young, which was criminal. I mean, all funded by quantitative easing. So we've got, you know, FSA, the PRA, HSE, all these regulations, MiFID II, Solvency II, all imported from Europe, designed to curb the prosperity of the British. I don't know if any of you have tried to open a bank account recently. I get asked, I've lived in the same house for 35 years and I've paid tax for 45 years. I still get asked every three years for a utility bill, a signed copy of my passport and everything else. Why do we have all that? And opening an investment account in a corporate name is just virtually impossible. So we've got countless unaccountable government-funded quangos. We need Thomas Cromwell back to do what he did to the... Where is he? So our country has seen the state grow far too much at the expense of the private sector. We've become petty, rule-ridden, short-termists and driven by a culture of do-gooder environmental wokery. Index-linked state sector pensions are becoming unaffordable and crowding out entrepreneurs and their small enterprises who are responsible for most of our economic growth. Quantitative easing, or as I prefer to call it, getting high on your own supply, has allowed this situation to arise as a cancerous statist growth shielded from financial reality proliferates.
Okay.
I've just got, can I just finish on? I've got to...
Quickly, because you can say some of this in
Okay.
the next bit.
Okay, so Liam can talk about QE, but they've done nearly £1 trillion worth of QE since 2008. And again, the consumer will be the loser. So my summary, I say it's time for radical change. I applaud Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng for their promising start. Under Reagan's agenda, success can only be achieved by combining tax cuts with dramatic reduction in regulation and an end to unfair arbitrary subsidies which distort the markets. The state must be radically reduced, quangos crushed, and malign monopolistic organisations such as the BBC made to secure funding from voluntary subscription rather than compulsory licence fees. Truss, Kwarteng and the new cabinet must hold their nerve, take heart from the fact that the mainstream media are so fearful of dynamic entrepreneurial Britain. We will once again save Europe from themselves by our example. I'm going to read you one more quote. I love this quote. Abraham Lincoln, he said, You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You cannot help the wage earner by pulling down the wage payer. You cannot help the poor by destroying the rich.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You can see, if anyone was going to do any modelling, that I've completely lost control of the chairing already, and it's run much higher than I said. But that was really great introduction. Thank you, Rupert. So Claire now. Claire's going to come back with some of the things that have been happening at the conference in the last 2 days and shedding some insight into with some of her thoughts on that. So thank you, Claire.
God, Rupert, you can tell you haven't spoken before. It was like the bloody whole thesis of the whole world forever. What a tour de force. I completely disagree with about 90% of it, but it was in a good spirit. I am a socialist. Well spotted. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened at Conservative Party Conference. Just a few observations, just because this is both a fringe meeting of the conference, but not everyone will have been at it because it's obviously a kind of closed shop. And these are just a way for me to reflect on, I think, a little bit about what I think is happening in politics more generally. So in my assessment, the Conservative parties, by all rights, should split asunder. It feels to me like 3 or 4 parties trying to get out, and it's only because of first past the post that they're actually contained together. And one of the things I really felt this year at the Conservative Party conference was that there was almost nothing that held them together. I don't really know how else to explain it. There was groups of people who ideologically bore no relationship to each other but are in the same party. And this is not just the old historic splits between kind of libertarians and One Nation Tories. This felt much more profound. And I think the reason for that is that the 2019 general election transformed what the Conservative Party was or could have been, because they were nearly wiped out in the Euro elections. They were in decline. People like Rupert and myself from different sides of the ideological divide stood for the Brexit Party in the European elections, humiliated the Tories, and they had to do something desperate. And the 2019 general election was where you saw a complete shift politically. Whole swathes of Labour voters voting for Boris Johnson's Tories, not because they'd become Conservatives overnight, but because they wanted to see Brexit done. But it meant that there was a break from the past. And so you had that happen. You had a mandate given to the Conservatives in 2019 that could have changed everything, could have really shaken up British politics, but it's been squandered. And we can discuss as to why, but it's been squandered nonetheless. But where I think that we can see that British politics is kind of out of sync is that the post-war political parties, or even the parties of the 20th century, all over Europe, all over the Western world, in fact, are falling apart. So if you look at the mainstream parties in the recent French elections, they got collectively between them the equivalent of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. I think it was 7% of the vote. I mean, just nowhere, wiped out. The parties that are emerging in different countries, whether that be Italy or Sweden or France, are certainly not parties I'd want to be associated with, but that's not really my point. The point is that they're new and they're different. And Macron, we should remember, is not even in a party. I mean, that is a new party, right? We kind of might think of him as an establishment. That's a new party. In other words, there's been a huge shake-up. And actually, there has been a huge shake-up in the UK. But at face value, you've got the same old parties, but they're not the same old parties. And anyone who knows anything about the history of the Labour Party, I can assure you that the Labour Party we have in 2022 bears no relationship sociologically or politically to the roots of the Labour Party historically. It is a completely different animal. So in that sense, politics is breaking apart, but taking the form that it has always taken. So it's a very odd period to be living in. And it's very frustrating if you're interested in politics and you feel that the only options are these two parties and you're looking on feeling politically homeless. It's very difficult not to just become nihilistic, cynical, give up, conspiratorial, imagine all sorts of things happening that aren't, all that sort of thing, and just basically wanting to tear your hair out. That is the atmosphere outside of the political parties. But this year's Conservative Party conference, it was the atmosphere in the Conservative. That's what happened. There's also, and always has been, a bit of a split in relation to those people who are pro-Brexit in terms of the splits in the Tory party, which was there were always a side of those who wanted Brexit, who was caricatured as the Singapore-on-Thames side, who just wanted tax cuts, free market, and so on and so forth, right? And that is what is characterised as the kind of Liz Truss, quasi-Kwarteng side at the moment. And then the more communitarian approach to Brexit, the take back control, a rebellion from underneath, ordinary people saying, right, we are going to now decide on our politics. And they are characterised by what are known as the blue-collar Tories, the red wallers, and actually in the Labour Party, kind of a bit blue Labour. Many of them actually are ex-Labour or sympathetic. I mean, to me, they're often like Labour Party MPs of old. And there is a clash there you can see already. And then there's a sort of third group, which is that the Cameron Tories, if I can characterise those, who basically were the modernisers of the contemporary Conservative Party, who, for example, called the referendum to smash Euroscepticism. I mean, that was the intention, if you remember. They called a referendum not because they wanted to leave the European Union, but because they wanted to stop anyone ever aspiring to leave the European Union ever. And they were going to smash it, and obviously they lost control. And if you remember also, Cameron was not the nasty party, and so brought in to the Conservative Party a whole range of individuals and ideas that were generally not considered to be conservative, and which completely discombobulated and threw everyone. Right, that's the kind of Conservative Party. I could do this over the Labour Party, but it's just that we haven't got time. And I've just come from the Conservative Party conference. But on top of that, and everything that happened post-Brexit and all the rest of it, we also had lockdown. And I do think that then discombobulated society, right? And it threw everything into a complete confusion. And we know what it was like in relation to Boris Johnson, but the whole politics around lockdown, I think, has thrown us all. So I am not a Thatcherite, the opposite, and was on the picket lines against Thatcherism, and certainly would never quote Ronald Reagan as a hero. And I think that sometimes we end up looking back to models where we knew where we were, like, oh, it's like the Cold War. We knew where we were then. We knew which side we were on. I think politics is much more confusing now. And sometimes even the left and right labels just don't and won't work. So I am considered to be far right because I'm a free speech absolutist, which means that I'm dodgy, which means that I only want free speech so that I can spout bile about minorities. I mean, that is a mainstream view of not just me, but of a range of people. And this morning at Conservative Party conference, I was at the Lesbian and Gay Alliance group gathering, which was great that they were allowed to organise. And they made the point that even within the Conservative Party, they get called transphobic. And they are treated as though this is the Lesbian and Gay Alliance. I hardly need to tell you, right? And we know what the gender thing. The point I'm making is people are delegitimised by these labels, right? So I'm not going to deal very much with the economic question, but why I said I'm not a Thatcherite or a Reaganite or in relation to this is, if the best idea for revolutionising the economy is to cut taxes, it is utterly dull. I mean, if people think that all you need to do is to cut taxes and the British economy will take off, they have missed the fact that the British economy has been in stagnation for quite a long time and that productivity has been incredibly low. What we need is investment in productive industrial growth, in R&D, risk-taking, a whole new atmosphere around society. And simply hoping that cutting back on taxes will mean that capitalists will all rush through this idea that all these people are only waiting to go out there, daring do, and set up all these new businesses and everything will be all right. I mean, I don't know if anyone's met a corporate recently, but they are risk averse. They don't want to take any risks in case they don't make any money. That's not actually even what old capitalism is. They are useless. They are not going to do it. They're going to sit on their hands. There's been plenty of money sloshing around and they haven't invested it productively. So I think we need to give them a push. And in that sense, although the state should have nothing to do with our autonomy and agency as individuals, that's different. The idea that the state should have nothing to do with anything is, I think, a joke. And is therefore, I want the state, if it makes leadership in relation to what kind of industrial strategy we have.
Last little bit, please.
Right. My last, because I haven't got... Right. What to do? I definitely think that no one should pay the poor card and say we're going to be impoverished by what's happening. I actually think we are going to have lot less money because we're facing a major economic crisis. And I wish that every grown-up in every party would look us in the eye and say, do you realise this is going to be bloody tough, right? But there's no point lying to us, right? We've lived on cheap credit and low interest rates. It's going to be tough. But I do not believe that we should go begging to the state. I don't think that we should encourage dependency on state handouts. But I do actually support those people who actually fight back. And in that spirit, I actually am delighted, for example, at the self-organisation of ordinary working people, if that takes the form of the Canadian truckers or the RMT rail workers, all to the good. I support those strikes. I support anyone who says enough is enough. We're going to organise. And in that sense, left or right, that's my line.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire. That was really, really brilliant and very useful for the discussion.
Okay.
And now, no, yeah, go on. Stop. We're having a little. Right, guys, kicking off back here. Molly Kingsley at the podium, please. Thank you very much.
I just wondered that.
Hi, yeah, I'm Molly Kingsley, and I'm one of the founders of parent campaign group Us for Them. Thank you. As it appears most of you know, we formed in the early days of the pandemic, really driven out of a concern about child welfare and in particular social distance. Actually, social distancing in schools was the first campaign, followed shortly by school closures, which were ongoing, and then other campaigns have included fighting against masks, querying the rollout of the vaccine to children. And I think each time, really, the concern that has driven the campaign has been born out of the sense that actually these measures were very harmful to children, were not evidence-based, and certainly weren't proportionate. And I guess, it's been going for 2 years now. And I guess over those 2 years, one thing that has become obvious is actually we're not really fighting about restrictions or about cost-benefit analyses or even about the approach we should take during a pandemic. Obviously, we are fighting about all those things, but really what this fight is about is a way of life. It's a fight about the way we do government, the way the principles and the ethics around governance, and the type of future, really, we want to bequeath to our children. And I think what has become clear, having been quite intimately involved now in some of, the fallout from the terrible decisions made during the COVID era, is that actually the appalling decision-making, the lack of ethics, the lack of due process is not just confined to the COVID decisions. It mars our entire public life. I was new to politics and I've just been stunned, astonished by the lack of ethics, the lack of integrity, and I think more prosaically, but probably more importantly, the lack of vision and long-term planning and strategy. I mean, just basic things that I assumed the people in charge knew what they were doing, and it turns out they really don't. I would have said historically that I was really proud to be British, but today I just feel that Britain is broken, totally broken. Our infrastructure from schools, libraries, swimming pools, transport, hospitals are in some cases literally crumbling. Our institutions seem to have forgotten that they are there to serve the public, not the other way around. We are, as I'm sure Liam will talk more about, we're mired in debt, and the people that are going to pay for that are our children, whose futures we have literally mortgaged to pay for our own bad health decisions and our government's terrible policy decisions. Investment in children and young people is at an all-time low. So whilst since 2010, investment in health has risen by about 42%, investment into education has risen by 3%. Investment in youth services just over the last year has fallen by $1 billion, 70%. 1 in 8 primary schools, 1 in 8 do not have a library in a school. Libraries are mandatory in prisons, but not in schools. There are 306 areas in the country where every primary school is rated inadequate or in need of improvement. It's no surprise that our children are amongst the unhealthiest and the unhappiest in Europe, and families struggle to make ends meet. Many simply can't afford childcare. 1 in 5 of our children leave secondary school without basic qualifications, and 1 in 4 of our primary school children are obese by age 11. Suicide rates among 15 to 19-year-olds are the highest they've been for 30 years. I do not accept this future for my children. And instead, I dream of a society that, not only tolerates and respects freedom, but protects and cherishes it. A society where truth and honesty is valued over public opinion, and a society where courage is valued over populism. Most of all, though, what I want to fight for, and I think what us for them have been fighting for and will continue to fight for, is a society where children are nurtured and cared for as what they are. They are exquisitely vulnerable human beings, but they are also this country's most valuable asset. So in that society, schools would work for pupils, not teaching unions. They would encourage creativity and pupil well-being rather than crush it. We would see investment in education, skills as innovation as the single most important thing a society could do. Early years education would be seen as that. It wouldn't be seen as childcare. I hate that term. Early years education is the essential building block of a child's life, and we do it abysmally. We would design our urban spaces for children, families, and young people. And in doing that, of course, we would solve for other problems. We'd solve for health problems. We'd solve for obesity. Our health policy would emphasize prevention and personal responsibility rather just treatment and late intervention. And we would see a consensus that children and young people must be protected from the clutches of big tech, big pharma, and big food. And in doing that, we'd tackle the regulatory capture which corrupts those industries. We are a long way from that point. And I guess, like many in this room, I feel very let down by this cohort of politicians, both on the left and right. I will be honest, I will say I no longer believe that this kind of radical change is going to come from either of the mainstream parties. I think Neil Oliver's got a great line about this. He says, "are 2 cheeks of the same arse," and I totally agree with that. But I do think the one really great thing about this period is it has it's actually mobilised a lot of people, including, I'm sure, some on this panel, myself included, who would not have touched politics because there was no need. And it has brought together many diverse views. As Claire said, I think it's shaken and is shaking up the period. And I really do hope that, however it's done, whether it's from a combination of people on the inside of politics, whether it's from lobbing grenades in from the outside, or whether it's from a few brave individuals taking, what seems like a very radical step to forge a new party and a new political consensus, I really do hope that comes from this period now. And it seems to me that we do have a moment in time, however it looks, to make that happen, because it needs to happen, because this is just an unacceptable society and an unacceptable future to leave our kids.
I'm really excited now because it's going to be a fantastic discussion. Great introductions. Liam Halligan.
Well, they say the best nights out are the ones you don't plan, right? The sort of spontaneous ones. And for me, this is a spontaneous Fringe meeting because Alan, in his typical way, just assailed me with lots of messages saying, come on, come on, come on. And when he told me who was on the panel, when I realised it included not only Alan, but some of my favourite people in public life, some of the bravest people. You know, Burke talked about, and he was no Burke, he talked about the little platoons, the people coming up from society who refuse to countenance, refuse to accept top-down statist solutions. And when it comes to Burke's little platoons, ladies and gentlemen, on the panel here, we've got 4 howitzers in those little platoons, so it's great to be here with them. So Alan's given me no notice of what I'm talking about at all. So what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the themes that Rupert picked up on and Molly, quantitative easing and so on, which I've written about for many years in the Q&A. I'll just give you a little kind of stump speech on housing, because my last book was on housing. It's called Home Truths. Housing to me is like the everything problem. So many of our problems go back to the fact that there isn't enough housing in this country. There is a chronic housing shortage. Productivity is linked to a lack of housing. Regional inequality, and we are the most regionally unequal major economy in the world, goes back to housing and related infrastructure. Mental health goes back to lack of housing. Poverty, life chances, crime goes back to housing. The fact that you have falling fertility now goes back to a lack of housing. And I think during lockdown, we saw more than ever why housing is important, because there was such a difference in terms of the experience between the laptop classes who dominate my industry, the civil servants, people who really don't understand how ordinary people live, and people living in inadequate housing. It's easy to love lockdown when you're sitting in your conservatory on full pay without having to commute, and you get to see a lot more of your family than it is if you're in a flat with 2 screaming kids in overcrowded conditions. So what I'm going to do very briefly is give you 6 numbers. I'm a statistician and economist by background, and I try and bring lots of numbers into my journalism, because God knows most journalists are completely financially illiterate. The first number is 8.6, and 8.6 is a multiple. That's the cost of the average home in the UK in terms of the average wage. These are averages across the whole of the UK. The average home in the UK costs 8.6 times the average wage. So if you're a couple on the average wage, which means you're doing pretty well, you're average, you can only generate 6 times multiple rather than 8.6. You can't afford the average home. And then you've got childcare. Sorry, Molly, use that word. Other costs. So the average professional, non-professional couple, they can't afford a home anymore. And 8.6 is the average. In the southeast, that multiple's 11.1. In London, it's 13.5. It's completely insane. House prices are massively ballooned. They're grotesque bubble driven largely by quantitative easing, but also a contrived scarcity created by our large oligopolistic house building industry. That is, massively over-dominant house builders who operate a series of local monopolies to bring a fewer number of houses to the market, drip-feeding homes onto the market to keep prices elevated. They said it was a conspiracy theory, but it's true. It's true. If you are an equity analyst, as I've been, this is how the big house builders trade. They trade on the contrived scarcity. They trade on the control they have over land. So 8.6 is a ridiculous multiple. When I bought my first property in the mid-90s, that multiple was 4.1. And the historic average since the war is 3.9. So that's how elevated house prices are. The second number is 61%. 61% is the share of all homes built every year that are built by the top 10 house builders, the 10 biggest house builders. Now, in general, I like the state to get out of the way. But every now and then, the state has to give capitalism a kick in the shins to make sure it doesn't become crony capitalism. I think in British politics, we picked the wrong Roosevelt. We picked we picked Franklin Delany Roosevelt in the 1930s with his New Deal, the efficacy of which is very hotly contested by serious economists, rather than Theodore Roosevelt, his Republican cousin, who at the turn of the century engaged in what we call trust busting, smashing up big corporations who are not engaged in competition, they're engaged in collusion, collaboration, crony capitalism, entwined with lawmakers, ensconced with politicians, giving them cushy jobs after they leave office, having not regulated them effectively. Does this sound familiar? These are the tech giants, ladies and gentlemen, are the Standard Oils of today. And it's not just in tech, it's in many of our commanding heights of our industries, be it telecoms, be it banking, be it pharmaceuticals, and particular, be it house building. We are ruled by oligopolies. Claire Fox's instincts on this are absolutely right. Capitalism works, it has to be regulated to a degree, but it's the worst possible system except for all the others, to paraphrase Churchill and slightly twist the quote around. But you know what I mean. And every now and then we need to properly, as I said, give capitalism a kick up the backside. And being pro free markets does not mean being pro big business. Sometimes it means precisely the opposite. I'm pro small business. And so many small businesses don't get a look in, particularly in our house building sector. I'll speed up. The next number is 13%. 13% is the share of the landmass of England that's covered by the Greenbelt. Now, of course, the Greenbelt's being concreted over, isn't it? Because that's what we hear on the various mainstream bulletins all the time. Well, it isn't, because the Greenbelt is now 167% bigger, so more than double, than it was in 1979. It gets added to all the time. And I'm all for keeping, you know, aesthetically beautiful parts of the UK and, you know, national parks and all the rest of it. But most of the Greenbelt is urban scrubland or farmland that we don't have access to anyway, that's sitting there fallow, getting subsidies for sitting there fallow, doused with chemicals. Why build Crossrail across London at £22 billion of taxpayers' expense and not let anyone build houses around the stations? That's where we are. And while 13% of the landmass of England is Greenbelt, the landmass of England that's covered with housing, including gardens, 1.7%. Very quickly, 1.1 million is my next number. That's the number of planning permissions outstanding that aren't used. 40% of planning permissions granted in London and the South East aren't used, a third nationwide. Why? Because the big house builders, an oligopoly, according to the House of Lords Economic Affairs Select Committee, a cartel, according to Michael Gove, he used that word, even though it applies to illegality. They hoover up the planning permissions and the small guys can't get them. The small guys use the planning permissions immediately because they need cash flow. The big guys sit on them because it's more valuable to them to stop others building so that their buildings go for more money. This is not capitalism. This is not working. The market for the biggest product that people buy in their lives and spend most of their lives paying for is broken. Two more numbers. One number is 1967. It's not a number, it's a date, but it's got numbers in it. See what I did there? 1967 is the last time we actually built a new town in this country. That was the date, that was the year that the new town designation order for Milton Keynes was given. So, in 1967, the population of this country was 45 million. It's now 67 million. I stand here as a fully formed adult, and I'm quite well formed, actually. And we have not built a new settlement in this country in my lifetime, despite the fact that the population has gone from 45 million to 67 million. If you wonder why horrible-looking homes are built in beautiful English villages on little parcels of land where they shouldn't be built, it's because we're not building any new towns. Build some new towns. Allow the planning game that those planning permission grants to be shared between local authorities and the landowners, and that money can then be used for infrastructure, and you can revolutionise the local politics of planning. And my last number, Alan, thank you for indulging me, is 1.2 million, because 1.2 million is the council house waiting list. Because we build so few council houses in this country, we are spending £30 billion plus each year on housing benefit, much of which has been used to help, quite rapacious sometimes, landlords who specialise in what we used to call DHSS clients. Remember the little cards in the newsagents? No DHSS. We've allowed them to build massive buy-to-let empires on state money with taxpayers' money because we're not building council houses that the state can then put at its balance sheet as assets so that it can be revenue neutral. And of course, a state-owned council house can be properly looked after, can be assessed regularly and easily for sanitary and other conditions, and so on. Look, I don't want a statist solution, but even as a free marketeer, a former asset manager, you know, I'm card-carrying, red blood in tooth and claw capitalist guy, but I would say a civilized society has to provide housing for its most vulnerable members, the 15 or 20% of the population, rather than leaving them at the whim of often rapacious private sector landlords with the state paying through the nose for substandard housing. So we do need to build more council houses. I'm astonished that the Tories have not got this. It should be at the centre of their levelling up strategy. Build some social housing. And my last point, Alan, there has not been... I did that without looking at him. If you look back over the last 100 years, there has not been a recovery from recession, ladies and gentlemen, that hasn't been associated with a big boom in house building. But I lied, because there's been one recovery from recession which hasn't been associated with a big boom in house building, and that's the recovery from recession since 2008-9, the financial crisis. It's been the weakest, most feeble, most unconvincing recovery from recession we've ever seen in this country, and that is not a coincidence. So, at the centre of this plan for growth should be more house building by the private sector, with the state kicking the big oligopolistic, cartelised house builders in the shins, and also on the side, adding to that, there should be a programme building more council housing for vulnerable families, keeping the private sector on its toes.
Thank you, Liam. Fantastic. Thank you, Liam. If that's what you do when you improvise, when you plan it, anyway, brilliant.
Plan it normal.
Brilliant. Yeah, exactly. What we're going to do is we're going to get Bernie to post her thing in a video separately, because we've had 4 really, really fantastic contributions, and I want to get straight into it and get you guys a chance to debate and discuss this. But it strikes me from this discussion that I had a range of questions I was going to ask everyone, but what we're really talking about is a couple of things, it seems to me. It's like what used to be called political economy, not politics or economics, but a kind of ideas that both relate to the economy, what people talk about sociology today, geography and culture. And it seems like there's a kind of illiteracy somewhat today, but, correct me if I'm wrong, because you've just made a very compelling case for the need to have investment in housing. Rupert makes the point about planning. Claire talks about the disorientation within the parties. And Molly's talking about the lack of a vision for the future. But where do those ideas come from? Is that something that we should be doing? And this idea of the relationship between the state and private enterprise, because I was struck by Bruno Marchese's book when he talks about capitalism, because it's not just the case that if you go back in the past and you see the private enterprise, he says that's a bit of a tautological argument. Actually, China's a very good or very bad example where they didn't take that pursuit, right? But they've had a massive transformation in society, right? With partly capitalism, but with a really strong state. And that's uncomfortable truth for some political economists. But I suppose just to simplify the question, right? We've just gone through 2.5, 3 years of a real difficult time. And you'd think that alongside the point about Brexit, that this would be a moment for dynamic wealth creation, excitement, robust ideas, and actually engaging the public as well. But in a way, it would be the perfect opportunity to do that. First question to everyone, why is that not happening, right? If you can all give your take on that, it would be great. Does anyone want to go first on it? Rupert or Claire? Rupert.
Well, as I think I said, I mean, I totally agree with Liam. I mean, monopolies have never been a good thing. And any proper capitalist system, I think since the Long Parliament, this country has usually broken up monopolies. They're not acceptable, and they do create all sorts of crony capitalism rather than true capitalism. I think regulation, Alan, as I said, is holding back businesses. I totally agree with Liam. Claire and I we have a different view on life, but we rubbed along well together at the Brexit party, didn't we, Claire?
We did.
Get a room.
So I as I said,
It's
I
not
mean,
that kind of meeting.
It's small businesses that drive wealth creation. It's small people building their businesses, as Liam said. It's not great big quasi-state monopolies are, funded by invisible pension savings, which is those are the companies Claire's talking about when she talks about big corporates, run now by woke little men like Paul Pullman and people like that. These guys are committee manipulators. They're not wealth creators, and they're not brought to account by the fund managers who represent all the people who save for their pensions, and they're not being brought to book by the government. Government can't manage its civil servants. We've had a proliferation of rules and regulations. I mean, honestly, I spend my life chasing paperwork, chasing forms, filling in ridiculous sort of questionnaires. Farming, they get all of our data every year, and yet we still have rafts of questionnaires that come through from the government from 20 years ago. But the state never dismantles this stuff, and it's got the data. So until we actually free the individual of a lot of this nonsense, you're not going to get wealth creation, even though QE has sort of papered over all the cracks in the short term. Bear me out, without QE, we couldn't have done the COVID lockdown.
Yeah.
And reality, coming back to what Molly said, reality would have been forced upon society, but it hasn't been. We've been living in a false world driven by QE, funded on printed money by the Bank of England in all of your name. It's demeaning the value of your savings. I mean, that's why you've got inflation. It's got nothing to do with it's.
We're going to come back to you in a bit.
That's why I don't think, until we clear that out, we're not going to get wealth creation. It's very difficult.
Okay.
It's like paddling in mud. You can't get anywhere.
So, Molly, you said something that really struck me, that you wouldn't necessarily say that you'd be proud to be British currently. And I think the question about what being British means is really strained as well. But what I recently, when I've got into sea swimming, and I went swimming in Norfolk, and we got really sick. And we got really sick. And the reason we got, and I remember looking back, and the water was a bit murky, and it was at a place where one of the highest levels of sewage went out there. And I was sick for 3 days. And in all the discussions about the institutions that Rupert was making, and some of the points you were talking about, how things get done, planning, it's beginning to look like, we used to talk about, I mean, I've traveled in India a lot, and I used to, you say, oh, you go somewhere like India, but India is not what it was, right? And neither is Britain, right? And we've got a crisis, haven't we, in our institutions and getting things done. But the question is, how do you tackle that? Now, you've begun to talk about a vision for the future, but just from your own point of view, what does that look like without being all highfalutin, like people sometimes think it all comes from the universities or the academy, but where do those ideas come from? Is it something you can see, you can just, a bit like Thomas Paine, a bit of common sense? Or what's your thought on that, Molly?
Quite a big question. I guess it's a blend of philosophies, isn't it? Because I'm not a fan of a huge state, particularly a huge useless state, or evil state, even worse. But actually, I do think there is a role for state intervention. I mean, there has to be, and just obviously I guess, primary focus area is education. Like you do need, or starting where we are today, I don't think it's realistic to say the state couldn't be involved at all. You know, that might be a goal for 300 years away, but we're not there now. And actually, if you're going to have, you know, same with healthcare, and there's lots of areas like that. So if you're going to have state involvement, you have to fund it, you have to invest it properly and smartly. And I think actually if there's one thing that as a theme that I see running through different policy areas, it's a lack of common sense. And, you know, I mentioned a bit with healthcare, it just seems like common sense. If we prevented people getting ill by encouraging them, and actually it would be people at their youngest, so children, to look after themselves, learning how to cook, to make exercise, good nutrition a way of life, you know, in 30 years down the line, we'd have a health service that was in much better state. You know, ditto on education. Like one of the problems I think we have with productivity in this country is we're not giving our kids the right subjects. So, you know, we have a real skills gap and we don't have the right apprenticeships. We don't have, you know, the right so give them the skills that would allow them to flourish as entrepreneurs. I mean, even basic things. We don't teach them financial literacy. How do we expect them to be good business people? It makes no sense. So I think common sense.
Thank you. On the way in, I met a gentleman who hopefully will talk, but he was saying that he lost his business because of lockdown, and he's in an industry I care very much about, which is the hospitality sector. And Rupert talked about the working from home and small businesses and the entrepreneurial thing. But Claire, I mean, I want to put this to you because you talked about maybe 4 splits within the Tory party and the similar thing in the Labour Party. And obviously you've been, but you've been an advocate for ideas for a long time and challenging questions and getting people to think about new ways of looking at things. I wonder from yourself, because you talked about new initiatives and there's obviously things like Enough is Enough and other organisations, but I'm not sure how new ideas they are. They certainly are putting themselves out there and contesting things and everything. So is it about new ideas or is it about just galvanising people around some of the old ideas? There's some good traditional ideas that need to be taken up? Just how do you see that? And in the light of Molly's thing, let's maybe make something new.
Well, one of the difficulties, and actually by coincidence, because we didn't know we were going to be on this panel together, I was doing an interview with Liam earlier on.
It was really glamorous. So Claire was sitting on a fold-down seat next to a fire extinguisher, and I was sitting on an overturned bin. And this is what the real media looks like. Of course, we didn't have keys to the BBC's swish seat studio with, you know.
As Liam pointed out, because we're both Irish, we're kind of used to roughing it. So it was kind of like a bit of an element of... right, so... Anyway, but one of the things that Liam said I thought it was really important because I think it, but he said it, was the importance of history. And actually, one of the difficulties is that everything is discussed in a kind of sense of immediacy. You know what I mean? It's like, what's happening now? And actually, history's become so dragged into the culture wars and politicised, so you can't even have serious political discussions with a sense of historical perspective any longer without it kind of, you know, people trying to score points. And I think that there is a kind of presentism that means that we don't have the ability to stand back. So when you're talking about ideas, I think that whether it's about the economy or whether it's about politics or political parties, that sense of history is being lost or not. We're not cultivating it enough. So I don't think that you can... It's not that you kind of go back to history and learn things in a silly, direct way. But you have to have a sense of where... the perspective of where we are now, what has happened before, where this fits in. So that's just a sort of general point. And one of the reasons I'm saying that was because I think that, you know, where Rupert and I definitely do agree is that things like quantitative easing papered over the cracks and an artificial keeping of the interest rates down gave the sort of sense that the economy was kind of getting by, right? But it was a completely artificial way for the economy. It wasn't ever really... The economy was not doing well. But the politicians wanted to take credit for that. I mean, they were the ones who wanted to say, well, look, the economy's grown. And it was like, it hasn't really, really grown, right? You've just just made it easy. You can survive it this way, right?
Failure is necessary in a capitalist society.
Well,
you clean out people
yes.
who aren't good at running their business.
But it's not just necessary in a capitalist society. It's actually necessary for moving things forward, right? Because obviously you wouldn't have had the the railways, as it were, if people said we're going to stop the railways because the most important thing is to keep subsidising the horse and cart. I mean, that's a stupid example, but you know what I mean, right?
Good example.
And it's like and also you don't know what it is you're holding back if you don't have a sense of innovation and R&D. I can't imagine what the new energies of the future will look like. They certainly are not confined to wind and renewables, or indeed just fracking. You know, it's like sort of like fracking nuclear and renewables and fossil fuels, and everyone goes, that's it. Well, no, that's not it. There's loads of possibilities, but you have to invest in that. And where I disagree, I think, is that I do not think at the moment that we have an atmosphere of real inquisitiveness that will take risks and basically, I mean, even the fracking company said, well, we're glad you're going to lift the moratorium, but it'd be very expensive. We can't guarantee a profit. I thought, that what kind of bloody capitalist are you? You know what I mean? Like I understand, I know, but you get the gist. Because he's going to now say there's all these regulations, don't make it worth it and all that. I know, but anyway, generally...
They're not going to invest, Claire, till the Labour Party accept fracking as well. Because if they
the idea that the Conservatives are the heroes of fracking
like
is
a married
such
couple,
a
aren't
bloody
they?
joke.
Crikey.
Right. The only other thing was, I one of the things just about this thing about what's going to happen, Alan, we can't have an immediate answer. There is no immediate new party or immediate new movement, right? And you were saying, where's the ideas and what movement and all the rest of it? I think that organisations like Us For Them prove that something can be created out of nothing. I mean, that's the point about Enough Is Enough, Us For Them. Any of these things, like, they didn't exist.
No.
And then somebody made them up. And then they existed, right? Yeah. And then actually people know about them and they did something, right? I like the Rights for Residents crowd, right? Just families of people who had parents or family in care homes, and they as they said to me, we don't do politics, we don't know what we're doing, right? Well, they've actually changed the way that debate happens, and they've actually had a massive impact, and so on and so forth. Well, there is an instinct in people which, when the government said we're locking you down, they then said, but who wants to volunteer to help? Hundreds of thousands of people emailed in and said, I want to volunteer. I don't want to be sitting on the couch doing nothing. I'll go and help. I'll visit. I'll do this, right? They never even got an email back. In other words, society was demobilised. And I think that my problem is that whilst I think there's a movement yearning to get out, I also think that society had the stuffing knocked out of it. And a lot of people actually did think, well, what can you do? A number of people who say to me, there's no point. What can you do? Yeah. They're all corrupt, them politicians. No point. No point. It's a sort of nasty kind of I mean, I understand it. But it's a real kind of like dispiriting atmosphere. So we have to be honest. If anyone thinks here it's easy to build a new movement or easy to solve the economic problems we've got, both of those things are fooling ourselves. This is tough. And it's going to require the ideas to win people over to whatever our ideas are. It's not going to be easy to do that. I just think it's worth a go. I mean, what's the point otherwise, right?
On that note, I'm going to ask you, Liam, because if you look at what's happened in the last couple of days, I think in a way it's the best and it's the worst of everything, right? You have a situation. My question is going to be about actually agency and about leadership within that, but agency. Claire's talked about, the idea that we could have all maybe come out and volunteered, and a lot of us wanted to volunteer, and then it was reined back in. It seems like all restrictions and impositions, not just from COVID, but in the last decade or two, have been about thinking you have to regulate the public, you can't trust them, and agency's limited. And in the past, the left and the right, let's just caricature you guys as the left, but they shared the idea about human agency. Conservatives may want to just have some tradition and maybe think that some people can be trusted, but generally there was agency, you got entrepreneurial spirit. And the left had an idea that people could transform things a bit more radically. It seems that a lot of that's gone away. And I suppose my question to you is this. The moment that Liz Truss and Kwarteng makes the announcement and then does a U-turn because of a shrill backlash, it begs some questions about leadership and about discipline. It also begs some questions about having those arguments with their own ministers and with the rank and file, not 5 minutes in advance, and the public. But within all of this, like with the spirit of challenging the building monopoly you talked about, and maybe zombie capitalism and having some creative destruction, as Schumpeter might call it, how much do you think that agency, I mean, people being prepared to do what you do, like speak, be outspoken, maybe not get invited, not in some media circles and all of that, but how much of that do you think can be inculcated and do you think's missing? Where do you see that? I'm interested in.
Sure. The first thing I want to say is, Fox and Lowe, they should have their own chat show, right? I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. I'd tune in, I'd listen. Second thing, I am pissing about my phone. That's because I don't wish to be rude. It's because I did an exclusive sit-down interview with Kwasi Kwarteng, and I'm sort of dealing with the social media fallout of that. So I'm here under those conditions. So I do apologise. I'm listening. It reminds me of when I was sitting in a school governors meeting on the finance committee while knocking out an op-ed for the Sun. You end up doing weird things in my line of work. I think you put your finger on something there, Alan. Characteristically, of course, you need discussion and debate and open, civilized disagreement to get to the best outcome, or even an okay outcome. And we seem to have so little of that. So much of our disagreement is shrill posturing and virtue signalling and silos and Twitter, rather than substantive discussion of the mechanics of how we're going to get something done, how we're going to solve a problem. You know, the media has a huge role to play here that it isn't playing. And it's partly because the media is so hollowed out financially because the tech giants take all the bloody money, because they're not publishers, right? But they take all our content, literally. And also because I think there isn't much money in the media at the moment. The people in the media, the media, particularly papers, used to be a fantastic way for, somebody who came from a sort of manual working family and with real ability and drive, within one generation, they could be literally sitting with the Prime Minister telling him, usually, but even into the 80s, or her, that if she did this, then it really wouldn't play well in Rochdale. Because that newspaper person came from Rochdale and they got their way in through local papers, they got their perch on a national. These are the people that ran ITN and the BBC in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. They came from towns, they came from regions. Now, a very, very high proportion of our journalists, particularly in broadcasting, they don't only generally come from London, they come from a few swish suburbs in London. I mean, it's complete groupthink. It's madness. And that's why they get so many of the big calls wrong. That's why they didn't understand why decent, civilised people might want to leave the European Union. They didn't understand why lockdown wasn't great. But I'm having a great time, darling. And there's such a gap now between the mainstream media and ordinary people. And I don't wish to be chippy when I say that. I've worked for the FT, I've worked for The Economist, I've worked for Channel 4 News. So I know these organisations from the inside. And they're not nearly as representative as they were even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's a big, big problem. And that feeds into why there's so little debate in general about policy, about the important things. A lot of journalists treat ordinary people as if they're thick. They think they can't handle the detail. They think because they watch soap operas, they don't want to know the detail. You can enjoy watching Corrie and also want to know what's being done in your name. And you can get down the library, even though Molly came out amidst the sort of tsunami of incredible numbers that she came out with. Your library, I'm nicking that one. I'll tell you, imagine that. So there is a real problem here, and I think the media, the top of politics is the same. Of course, I mean, I put this to the Chancellor today, and it was great to hear the World at One having to cite a GB News interview through gritted teeth. I did enjoy that. And The Guardian. I put it to him, and he's, he takes a lot of blows, but he's a really thoughtful, really bright bloke. He's not from a sort of posho background. He had a really driven Ghanaian mum, and he won a scholarship. He got a free place at Eton, right? I mean, that's an astonishingly difficult thing to do. They don't just give away PhDs in history from Cambridge. And I have talked to him about this, and on camera today I said to him, look, but why did you throw so many policies into one package? Why did you lower the top rate of tax when the cost of living crisis is squeezing? It looks venal. It looks tin-eared politically. It's not even a radical policy. The top rate of tax was 40% throughout the Blair and Brown years. This is not an extreme measure, but it was just ill-timed. And it was ill-timed, and he kind of admitted that. Though, of course, it's difficult to admit anything because then it's a gaffe. So it strikes me that there isn't enough discussion at the top of government. He would say in his defence, but, you know, we had to do something quickly. We had to do the energy price cap, and they did. But of course, it was obvious to a lot of people that all the focus was going to be on lowering the top rate of tax because it just looked inept politically, combined with the bankers' bonuses and the currency. I know lots of currency traders. I used to be, you know, in financial markets a lot. They didn't dump the pound because of the £2 billion you might spend on lowering the top rate of tax. If you lower the top rate of tax, you'd actually make money. That's what happened in 2012 when Osborne did it. It's what happened in France when they did it. It's because they could see, as plain as the nose on their face, there was going to be a huge political row, and some people might start putting letters in again, which is what's actually happening. And they don't want another change of government, as Brenda in Bristol said. What, another one? So it's a shame that as there's been a lack of a debate and more posturing over personal positioning rather than actual policy substance in the media, that's been reflected back into in a kind of doom loop of stupidity by the top politicians as well. And I think the public looks on and thinks, you know, I'm struggling. I'm trying to do the best for my family. I'm doing 3 jobs. And this poncy political media class, they're sort of playing parlour games. And I think unless the political and media class, of which I'm, of course, a part, gets hold of this, then they're really going to lose the confidence of the general public, and our politics will get more extreme in a not a good way.
So on that, I'm going to come to all you in just a minute. I'm going to ask a very quick, short question that I want 30 seconds on from everyone. I want to come to you. This is an opportunity for all of you to ask and say things, to challenge things, and to put them forward. So please do, and hear any of your reflections on some of these things, how much you think things are possible or not. I often hear there's nothing that can be done, as Claire said, if you think that's actually the case or not. We've seen in Germany, right, that which is very strong industrial country, Europe's strongest, one of the strongest economy. We now see masking being brought back in public. And we also see everyone from the Daily Mail to the Guardian talking about the steep rise in COVID and the NHS crisis that we get told about every year. How likely do you think that some of these knee-jerk reactions will come around again? Or do you think we're in a different position? Just quickly, quick answers, all of you.
Can I just very quickly, Alan, go? Liam.
Well, I want to say no.
On the media, my time at Southampton, and it's interesting, I thought people would watch what my hands were doing, building the stadium, the youth academy and everything else. But I was wrong, because powerful forces can actually, through PR and through everything else, they can throw enough money at it and they can distort reality. So I fought 2 libel trials. I had my phones hacked. I'm just a sort of provincial lad who ended up running a football club, and I think, built the stadium for them. But where I was wrong, Alan, and where the media is powerful, and where Europe spends a lot of money, and where the state spends loads of money, PR can distort what everybody thinks about. And I liken you'll probably hate me for this, to football fans, because my football fans got swayed by all this nonsensical PR, and they loved their football club like we all love our country. And the problem is that these dark forces are able to manipulate how we all think. And what we have to do is basically remember that what we're reading in the papers very often isn't necessarily the truth. So people need to think for themselves.
Right, So now what we're going to do, I've got a few people that have really want to speak. So I'm going to actually come to the audience. I'm going to come back. I'm going to take rounds of questions and points. On this side, we've got Danny, who's an ambassador from Manchester. On that side is Stephen, who runs Law or Fiction, which many of you will know. And so put your hands up and we're going to take groups. So we're going to start with Charlie there. If you say who you are and if you're part of anything, you don't have to, but we'd love to and amongst friends here. So Charlie, and then we're going to work our way down. Was there a hand here? And then we're going to come across the audience this way, take this side, and then we'll do a few on there. We're going to take a few.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm Charlie. I've known Claire for ages, and I've actually met Ellen before in the bar in Brick Lane as well. I just wanted to come in. There's no way we're going to resolve this debate tonight because I think there's an awful lot to unpick here. But I wanted to come back, really, I guess, in main response to Liam and Rupert, and just say that I also, as Claire did, disagreed with an awful lot of what was said there. I just wanted to lay out some features here that, in terms of the British economy, the most rapid and sustained and significant period of the well-being of average household income in this country came in the post-war period, when those top rates of income tax, which Rupert mentioned, were in place. I wanted to say that in terms of the 1970s, which obviously maligned as a sort of a lost decade economically, it's the only example of a recession in history that I'm aware of where average household incomes were higher at the end of that decade than at the start. That from the end of the 70s, that was the start of the decline in growth in real incomes. And that growth completely stalled in around 2008. And for the last decade, we've completely lost all of that growth. And moving on to some of Liam's points with regards to housing, I agreed with an awful lot of what you were saying on housing, actually, Liam. But the house prices at 8 times the national average income have existed before. The last time was in around 1910. Prior to the building of lots of council houses, and in the 1880s, when there was a zero regulation, which, to be honest, sounds a lot like what Rupert was arguing for, they were as high as 12 times more than the average incomes. And I just wanted to sort of pick apart this idea about this true capitalism as opposed to fake capitalism, because I come from the left, you might be able to tell from what I'm saying here, but to me this sounds a lot like Trotskyists talking about the difference between the true communism of their imaginations as opposed to the real communism of the Soviet Union. And I feel there's the similar idealisation here. So just to finish off on this point, I think, Rupert, you criticised a lot of things very accurately, the Quangos, the PFIs, all of these half-baked mishmashes which please nobody. But the reality is that the reason that those things emerged was because when we started deregulating society, when we started rolling back the state in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, the services which people in this country now come to expect as part of what they consider to be a just standard of living for them, the market could not provide by itself. And that's exactly the same for housing benefit. That's why we're in the muddle that we're in with housing benefit, is because once you stopped building council houses, the market did not step in to build affordable houses for people by itself. And if you hadn't provided housing benefit, we would have just had a massive epidemic of homelessness. And ultimately, that is the crisis that we're facing today. So I just wanted to come in here again, and one final point as well, to talk about productivity. Now, for me, there's a key issue here with productivity, and I completely agree. There's an elephant in a room that people don't talk about. When you start seeing declining rates of productivity, again, from the 1980s, and you've got to look at why that is the case. You have the Solov paradox, where we're increasing our technological capacity, we're increasing the rate we're decreasing the rate of hours worked per unit produced in terms of technological advantage. Yet in all the advanced Western economies, where all of these new labour-saving technologies were being introduced, productivity starts to decline. Productivity growth starts to decline, I should say. Why is that the case? And for me, there's a simple answer here. It's the loss of manufacturing. Manufacturing, this country used to make things. We had the best engineers in the world. Our engineers in Boeing and what's now British Aerospace maintained parity in terms of technological growth. We invented civilian aircrafts at a time when in the Soviet Union, the Americans were investing tens of millions times the amount that we were. And we managed to do this because, sorry, Alan's hurrying me on. Basically, what I'm saying is manufacturing is a fundamentally more productive sector of the economy than the service sector, the tertiary sector, which we've replaced it with.
Got it.
It was a political decision to get rid of our manufacturing.
Thank you. Right, so we're going to come down here. We're going to get everyone in. So we're going to do a round, then we're going to come back, then we're going to come back to you. So come down. There's who was the first one with the hand up? Yes, here. And then behind there. Yeah.
Hi there. My name's Martin Murray. I owned the UK's longest running nightclub. Father opened it in 1972, January the 12th. 2020, January, I gutted it, ready for a massive refurb, change of business model, as the nightclub's world has changed. End of Feb, there's these rumours, things in Italy. So I delayed the refurb. I delayed a personal loan of £500,000.
Wow.
My place held 900 people. On a busy night, I would employ 35 people a night. Wow. I delayed it in Feb. 10 days later, the world locked down. And I thought, they can't do this. But it's when they took away our bank holidays. That Easter, that run of bank holidays sets the nighttime economy for the whole year. We have a run of 4 of them. The whole of England for hundreds of years have partied, whether it goes down to Brighton, down to Torquay. For hundreds of years, that launches our year. And I knew then it was over, it was done. So I decided, I'm finished. I did not see our 50th birthday, January of this year, because of those actions. So you can imagine my emotion from all these things that they did. I sold most of my equipment, my booths, my chairs. Most of it went to Africa. It's places like Nigeria where I've got connections, who are doing, it's more like the wine bars of the 1980s in Nigeria. Yes, I kid you not, it's fantastic. Yes, I've done an attempt across the whole of this world. From the Gambia, Nigeria, America, Canada, across this country, I've been involved. I know this trade. And that's what saved me from going bankrupt to being homeless. But one thing that changed more than anything else, and Molly, you said it, we have no youth centres anymore. I tried to do an under-18s disco 2018. In the end, I scrapped it. Every time I did it, I had to put a full 12-page risk assessment in to do it, including stating where security would be at every hour. I had to have more security for 200 kids than for 1,000 adults. I kid you not. And why? Because they were fearful of what a minority would say. And everyone here said the same thing. It's that shrill of the media that they fear. We changed the U-turn. It wasn't because of logic or reason. It was the shrill of the media. And the only way that stays isn't by imposing a law. It's by further groups like Together. It's further smaller parties. It doesn't matter what their political view is, but when enough of these groups get together and start shouting louder, then these media people, as you said, they have no training anymore. These aren't the Fleet Street reporters of old with education. They just get placed in a spot and shout, and people get fearful because of it. And that's what must end.
Thank you. I'm very sorry to hear. I feel your pain, but I know that situation, and I'm glad you're still in business. To the gentleman behind with the glasses there, please. Then we're going to move. We'll take a few more, and then we'll come back round.
Hello, my name is Paul. I'm funny enough at the conference itself. Claire might recognise me. We had a bit of a nice chat yesterday. First of all, I've really enjoyed the discussion so far this afternoon. I think personally it's been the best Fringe event I've actually been to. It's been the most honest and it's been fantastic. If it was my choice, I'd want it to be obligatory for the Conservative MPs over there to be listening to the discussions. It's been really, really good. I guess where I struggle, though, is, it's very easy to identify some of the challenges we're facing, such as the housing crisis. It's so easy to identify the issues. The challenges are identifying the solution or putting into practice the solution. So when we are talking about average house prices being sort of 8.6 times average salary, oh, let's build some houses, it always comes down to where do you build these bloody houses? Because, for people who've paid a lot of money for their house, I enjoy running. I run through the fields. It's fantastic. The idea that people are going to build a like, great big housing estate on this gorgeous countryside sort of fills me with horror at two levels. Got it, all the traffic. My house might go down in value. If I've just borrowed 8.6 times my average salary to buy the house, and then, a year or two from now, it's going to be 3 times the average salary. Bugger. I'm now living in a, I don't know, £300,000 house, whatever. Everyone else has paid just 100,000. I'm stuffed financially. How do you fix that sort of thing?
Very good question. So we've got if you can carry on with the mic, come along. There's a lady there with her hand up, and then two of you, then next you. The lady first, and then you. And then we've got a couple more there. Then I'm going to come back and then come back out to you.
I guess.
If you want to be on camera, yes. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Emma Dixon, right? On a totally different subject, to bring back some sort of confidence in our MPs, so that they represent the people that they are supposed to represent, could we not actually consider taking these party whips away? Because, at the end of it, we are, my own MP wrote to me and said he was against vaccine passports when it came push to shove. He voted for vaccine passports as the party whip told him to do. So that is my first point. Going back to small businesses, during the lockdown, it is certainly small businesses that have been closed down in the majority. As we go forward, we have these ESGs. COP26 is bringing in this net zero. That's whether we believe in man-made climate change or not. But you have to understand that Mark Carney has said that any business that doesn't comply with his net zero future will be bankrupted. This again will affect the small businesses because, of course, big corporations can offset their supposed energy by putting a few trees. So I can't see that the small business is going to get developed in the future at all. And of course, as I'm sure, going back to the newspapers, they have done very well from the government and have taken lots of advertising from the government over the last 2.5 years. And we have had, Ofcom has told us in its letter that they told, mainstream media that they had to conform to the government narrative. Yes, they were allowed, to perhaps bring on a dissenting voice as long as they were trampled upon. And of course, we have, the Trusted News Initiative that has brought together mainstream media and big tech so that we get the one narrative. So I think there is a lot to unpack here. And I would say, extraordinary enough, it has seemingly been a bit of the let's not mention the war here today, because, I could go on, but, when we look at, honestly, from our MPs, we have 650 of them. There must be one MP in there that has looked at the history of Ukraine, and there should be some allowance for voices. I mean, there was 11 Labour ministers got up and said, oh, no, let's stop the war. Immediately, party whip said, shut up. This is why we have no trust.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen, and then Ross, and then we'll come back, and then we're going to come back on that side with Stephen. If you keep your hands up so Stephen can see, he's going to come to you next after this round. So the gentleman, and then Ross, and Ben.
I'm Robert, a retired engineer that lives within cycling distance of this venue. And it's a comment for Liam on location of housing. There is an argument for building in villages on condition that you do the job properly and it's not an eyesore and you're not building on valuable agricultural land, for the viability of village businesses like a village shop and so on. So if you can put the right kind of housing into villages and you have the right kind of people that want to move into it, and that does include the local agricultural workers that grow up in the village, want to work on the village farms or other local industries and cannot afford to get a home because of all the retired people snapping up the housing and so on, you keep the viability of a village business like a village shop that otherwise might be forced to close for lack of customers. Thank you, Liam.
Thanks. If you go just behind you, thank you, sir. Just Ben, put your hand up there. Just he's got it. That's it. Great, Danny. And then to
I don't normally speak actually, but I'm going to do it today. I was just thinking on numbers that I think what sums up what our problem is 67 million and 600. Those two numbers. And my thoughts is that they could lock 67 million people down, but they can't stop 600 people coming over illegally every day, which is the issue, because you were talking about housing. Well, we can't build enough houses for the people coming across the channel. So to me, my feelings are, when I speak to people out in the world, is there's a total lack of trust in government. They can't get the small things right. How are they going to get the big things right? And we need to, to me, it's starting at the bottom and making sure they can get the simple things in life right. Then the trust might build. So that's my opinion.
Just to say that Ben runs a company and a CEO and is a great leader. He is the person that is running the company called Juniper that has furnished us with all the amazing graphics and all of that, and he's helped us out from a very early stage. In no small part, we owe him a debt of gratitude, so thank you to Ben. Ros. We're going to go to Ros, and then we're going to come to the panel for quick responses. You can't do everything, just take one thing and come back, and then we're going to come back out on that side with Stephen. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ros Jones. I'm a retired paediatrician and a member of the Heart Group. I was going to pick up particularly on Molly's point about children being our most precious asset. And we somehow as a society allowed us not only to close schools and push children into masks for 8 hours a day, but we said it was to protect Granny, not to kill Granny. And then we've done even worse, because we've then pushed a novel technology drug with no long-term safety data whatsoever into children to protect their granny. And we're still doing that, even now that we know that it does not prevent infection and transmission. So you can't protect your granny by taking this, and all you're going to get is harms. But I also wanted to come back to your point about getting rid of the whip system, because I, like you, have an MP who's a junior minister. She writes lovely letters back to me, agreeing with half the things I send her, but she never votes the other way. And also, if we're going to get business up and running and people out and about again, we've got to somehow undo the fear. So you might look at what we've done to children and think that the government has shown a total disregard for children's health and well-being. But it's not the government only, it's the fact that SAGE and the MHRA need to be added to your list of dysfunctional quangos. They need to be... And on a practical level, they need to be separated from the financing by the big pharmaceutical industry, and they need to have a proper, transparent system for sharing data. And we need an end to the awful censorship, which, why am I, as a retired paediatrician, being clapped in this room? Why isn't there an actual jobbing paediatrician here? Because they're afraid to speak out. And the silencing of medical dissent, of questioning some of the narrative, has left us with 3 political parties all saying the same. We've had no opposition whatsoever to any of this.
Okay. We're going to carry this conversation on, by the way, afterwards, because so we're going to carry on. So we're definitely not going to cover everything. If you can pick one thing and short responses so we can get back out to have people respond. Molly, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, I'm just going to talk about the point made at the beginning by the gentleman up here, which was the investment, post-war investment, and how that can lead to growth. And one of the things that just struck me as you were speaking was that when we were in the middle of school closures, Gavin Williamson kept talking about a Beveridge plan for education. Do you remember that? Oh, it'll be fine. They'll all recover. We'll put money in. Don't worry about it. Obviously, that didn't happen. But and what makes me very sad is that actually the whole language, I never bought the recovery thing, but let's just use that as a shorthand for investment into children. And that seems to be being lost from the public discourse. And I think that's really sad, because actually if there was one thing that we could do after this period to actually really reinvigorate growth and productivity and innovation, it would be to invest in children and young people, university students, I think, as well, who lost so much. And, you know, that, it seems to me, there is space to keep pushing for that as we come out of this period.
Thank you, Molly. Rupert?
Well, can I pick up on? I'd like to pick up on your point about this COVID management, which I think you're absolutely spot on with that. My own personal opinion is that giving mRNA experimental jabs to children is criminal, and I have argued with many of my friends. I think what we've got is a battle between the baby boomers who have now retired and were worried about dying, and the young people. And the disappointing thing is that the young people didn't speak out more, because they are the ones that have suffered. Their career at university has been affected, their social interactions been affected, their mental health's been affected. And this is all basically, as you say, a cross-party agreement. I mean, Keir Starmer would have locked us down harder and for longer. So let's not forget that. I hope one day that we will get some form of proper inquiry. How Matt Hancock released all those infected patients into the care homes and nobody seems to have picked it up. I just watched with horror as the central planners made wrong decision after wrong decision. And to me, it just shows that you cannot allow the state to start planning everybody's lives. We're all individuals. We should all make our own decisions on matters like that. And frankly, jabbing young children, there's going to be a huge toll to pay somewhere.
Okay. Liam?
Fabulous range of contributions from the panel. Great to see Dr. Ros Jones in the audience, who I was honoured to interview on Planet Normal in the midst of lockdown. Incredibly well-informed, brave, courageous intervention by her. If you Google her name and Planet Normal, you can listen to that. I mean, how right she was. I mean, I know you don't like applause, but you were and are incredible. I'd like to briefly pick up on, I think, Charlie's point and Robert's point on housing. Just on manufacturing, I completely agree with you, Charlie, about the importance of manufacturing. We are still the 9th biggest manufacturer in the world. It is still 17% of our GDP. We're pretty good. We're pretty good. We do ourselves down, and the media does ourselves down, but we mustn't, because we still are world class in many aspects of manufacturing. It doesn't employ as many people as it used to, but it still employs millions and millions of people on good salaried jobs that are relatively secure in the modern world. I mean, we're here in the heart of the West Midlands. This is still one of the major manufacturing districts in the world. And I think we need to keep sight of that while adding to it. On your point on housing, the private sector hasn't built enough houses, not because it isn't the state sector, because in the past, the private sector has built the vast majority of houses that exist in this country, but they've been built by smaller firms that have been acting in a competitive way. Our house builders at the moment are massive monolithic land banking companies that do a bit of house building on the side as a front. That's what's happening. And they're the kind of companies that Claire mentioned that aren't risking their capital because they're not at risk of anything, because they're not subjected to any real competition. They are in cahoots with our political class. Property interests are now the second biggest donators to the Tory party, second only to financial services. And Robert's completely right, of course. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any building in villages, not at all. Unusually for a sort of mainstream media person, I don't live in Chiswick. I live in a small market town in North Essex, surrounded by small villages. Of course, you can build well in villages and small towns, and we must. So all local people can live near their families, and they don't have to go to London to be a success. They can live in their local communities. But what I'm saying is that we need to build big new towns. I'd slightly take issue with the point about immigration, there's a chapter in my book, Home Truths, about the links between the housing shortage and immigration. You know, we've got a shortage of housing because we don't build enough houses. You know, I'm you know, the clue's in the name. I'm Liam Halligan. I come from a long line of Irish builders. You know, the people in my family, they lived in one house and they built hundreds. And they built lots of roads and underpasses and sewers. And immigrants build houses, but they need to be working in an industry that wants to build houses. And we have an industry at the moment that wants to control the supply of housing, contrive scarcity in an oligopolistic way to keep the margins high, to keep the number of houses high. It's not that they're private sector companies that's the problem. To Charlie's point, if I may finish, it's the fact that they're not in a competitive environment. If they're in a competitive environment, they would build more houses, and government has to bust up the crony capitalism, the cartel of house building, in order to let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Thank you. And Claire.
Some great contributions, and I'm going to have to go relatively soon because as much as I support the strikes, there's a strike tomorrow, and that usually means the day before you can't get a bloody train. So I've got to travel. But anyway, I wanted to pick up on just two very quick things then. Charlie explained very well the point about manufacturing, and I think that's the point about productivity. Often productivity is discussed in this kind of way about people being lazy. Do you know what I mean? It's like sort of there's a productivity crisis, people won't do any work. And there is a kind of, people are definitely, in my opinion, less productive when they work at home, but that's not the basis on productivity crisis. What we need is into investment in technology, R&D. That's what I'm trying to say, and a big manufacturing. And it will be, but it won't be manufacturing the things that we've necessarily manufactured in the past, but unknown things that we'll manufacture in the future. That's what I think we need, a new industrial revolution. And it drives me mad that the only time this ever gets discussed is in relation to green jobs. And that immediately has decided what it is you manufacture. You say, oh, yes, there will be jobs and there will be an industrial revolution around renewables. You know, that's it. That's the only time I ever hear it being discussed. It drives me mad, which is why I can't stand the net zero orthodoxy, which is I suppose, the point about party whips is, I mean, it drives me mad as a system, but you don't need them because there's an awful lot of orthodox thinking in Parliament. Do you know what I mean? The idea that people are saying, well, I would have voted and been dissenter if it wasn't because of the party whip system. Come on, that's an excuse very often. It's the silencing dissent point that I think is very important here. I, as it happens, am very enthusiastic about Big Pharma. I'm a great enthusiast for medical science and for pharmacological intervention into our lives in general. And I have been worried about the number of people who have drawn the conclusion, because of some of the ways that the vaccine has been foisted inappropriately on the young, and the illiberal vaccine mandates and so on, forcing people who didn't want to have the vaccines to have them, that has led to a kind of cynicism about pharma. I think that's not helpful myself, because I am an enthusiast for those kind of contributions. But it doesn't, you know, that's my opinion. That's, other people have another opinion. These are the things which we are grown up enough to be able to discuss and argue over, and I mean argue over. The sad thing has been that the silencing of dissent and the emergence of a much more censorious atmosphere around this issue, well, not only this issue, of course, the online safety bill, it's not just this issue. But what it's done is it's made people, you know, as soon as there's a clampdown on information, or any discussion at all on the nature of vaccines or what have you, it makes people then think that you can't believe anything about medical intervention. People start going a bit, you know, wacky. There's lots of dark web rabbit holes that I know people have gone down in these circumstances, and I don't blame people, because they think, if you won't let me discuss this, I'll find out myself. And when there was a sort of contributions about the not trusting the media, which is entirely appropriate, but we also have to be careful ourselves that people don't get stuck in their own bubble, right? Because the number of people who say don't trust the MSM Club. Don't believe anything I say in any newspaper. Don't believe any scientist or any politician. But I'm sending you this video, and what's in it is completely true. And the thing is, I've got that same video from 1,000 people, and it's, I mean, often bollocks. I mean, it's just, you know, consummate, but, you know, also nonsense. But in other words, you can kind of say, you can do a sort of mirror image of what you hate, right? Which is, of course, you shouldn't watch the media and just believe everything you said. But it's also the case that alternative media and things that you're not allowed to hear, it doesn't mean that's right either, right? So we need to have open debate and discussion so that we can say to each other, you're talking rubbish. And then the other person says, no, you're not, and I'm, you know, blah, blah, blah. And that's how we have resolved things. It's called politics. It's called civil society and public life. So I have been very concerned about the silencing of dissent, but it doesn't mean that all of the views that have been silenced are right. It's about the state trying to impose an orthodox view, but it doesn't mean that every alternative, unorthodox view has any merit.
Thank you. Right, we've got less than 10 minutes, and I want to get everyone in. So if you could, you know, we're going to go on this side, Stephen, this there at the back there, Magnus, and then we're going to come round. Right. Yeah.
Okay. On the question of productivity, what surprised me really is that there seems to be very little discussion about the role of the banks. Now, America went from being in the Great Depression in the 1930s to being the world reserve currency by the late 40s. Germany was obviously completely smashed during the Second World War, but had a greater GDP than Britain by 1968. Japan, utterly devastated by the Second World War, but by the mid-1980s, the top 20 banks by capitalization were all Japanese. Taiwan, like Korea. What all these countries had in common was that there was a massive explosion. I'm not even getting to China. Had a massive explosion in their banking system, and it wasn't large banks; it was small banks that were locally based, small banks that lent small amounts of money to small businesses. Now, the result of that is an enormous mushrooming of the SME sector, the resulting tax, but the resulting employment on the back of that. And exactly the same thing happened to bring like China out of Maoist communism. Deng Xiaoping introduced elements of capitalism, and the way that he led that was by this enormous explosion in small and local banks. Now, universally, this technique seems to have worked. So I really don't understand why there isn't much interest in a really vibrant local banking sector in this country.
Thank you. Right, yeah. Keep your hands up if you want to speak, so I can see how many we've got to get to. We've got to get to some here and round it. Okay, great. Yes.
Hi, my name is Luke. I work in public affairs of our Scotland podcast. My main question is for you, Liam.
Yeah.
So with the mini budget, I was thinking about how the government reacted to what the plans were, and the policy idea that I came to was the raising the personal tax allowance from around 13,000 to 20,000. I'm no economist myself. I thought best class was only a little bit more than me. What do you think of this idea? And if not, what would you suggest? What if you were the Chancellor? What would be your policy to solve the
Great, good question. Thank you. If we're gonna come down, that gentleman to come down. We're gonna go across, and then we're gonna finish up there.
Hi, my name is Nick. Just an observation from some of the panel. This theme of agency and discussion rather than censure. One of the things that struck me throughout this, and it's sort of aimed a little bit at people younger than me, but how little debate or discussion there was about any of the COVID restrictions, any of the climate change debate. And I think, thinking back to my student days, The most shocking thing was it was only the students at, I think, Manchester University who were willing to rebel and try to put their barricades down. Now, that worries me if we have young people who are not engaged with history, with the need to debate and discuss things, and who are just willing to sort of say, oh, no, I'm not commenting on that, and just tuning into the narrative they have been fed. When I was at school, you were encouraged to discuss and debate. You had some good arguments, but there was still that encouragement. And I think it was the Manchester image that brought it home to me. I thought, why the hell have no other students or universities rebelled like this? And that left quite an impression.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to come down and then we're going to come across. I'm not sure we're going to come back to you.
Just one or two quick points. My name is Michael Jones. I'm a musician and a historian. And on the subject of ideas, there's nothing new under the sun, but ideas evolve and become new as we go along. On the subject of new towns, don't forget the vision of Ebenezer Howard, who created Letchworth and Welwyn Garden City. What people don't know is that he was a stenographer in the law courts, and he had to witness so many terrible injustices being committed on people, and that gave him a burning vision to create the concept of the new town. Also, what is democracy? Demos, the people. Kratos, power. People, power. And then the final point is, I'm a historian. Every historian should have on their writing desk the phrase of George Santayana, those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat them. 101 years ago, the playwright Chapek created the word robot. 99 years ago, the word disinformation was created by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And remind you of anything. And 100 years ago, when Mussolini marched on Rome, he made the famous saying, fascism should really be called corporatism. It is the merging of the state and corporate power. And that is the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, so we got the lady there, then in the middle, two in the middle, and then the final one up there, and then we're coming back. Thank you, yeah.
Thanks.
My
name is Jo Cullen. I run a company called Flourishing, which teaches people how to be mentally healthier. And I do a lot of work with GPs, trying to improve the mental health outcomes with patients. There's a lot of work to be done there. I was very interested in what Claire said about we aren't an inquisitive society anymore. I think it was Claire used that term. We really lack a sense of being inquisitive. And I just wanted to make a few points about that. What the problem is, I think, and what we can do about it. So, you know, we're crying out for the encouragement of free thought and free expression in education. I mean, vital. You know, more and more we're seeing our young people being asked to write things which are totally one-sided. You know, in Bristol, it's all about, give me 10 reasons why Edward Colston was the most appalling person who ever lived. You know, not what did he do, which was good. I was very supportive of Molly and Us for Them through COVID hugely. I did a bit of some webinars, I think, for you as well at that point. And I'm very struck that with remote teaching and learning, there's only 80% coverage and 50% retention. You know, and more learning is being done remotely, even now. So I also think that through working remotely, people out in the workplace, when you're working remotely, you're not discussing, you're not generating ideas, and it becomes extremely sterile. We have become a very dependent culture. You know, where people are all the time asking, what should I think about? We saw this over Brexit. You know, I can't choose how to vote because nobody's telling me what I should say. You know, extraordinary. And finally, we've become a society of huge anxiety. And what I know through psychology is that when we're anxious, we cannot think clearly. We think in a very black and white way. So what do we need? We need teaching thinking. We need people getting together to work, vital. We need children to be learning together, learning from each other, learning in a very interactive way. And we need to be in a society where we are just toning down the anxiety so people can start to think creatively. Vitally important.
Thank you. Good points. Those two, and then there. Yeah.
Yeah, good evening. Just a couple of things I'd like to mention, please. I'm Keith from Newcastle under Lyme, by the way, a retired business owner. Two things. One thing, what Rupert mentioned. The last couple of years, most governments have been acting in lockstep. Do they think, you mentioned dark forces, what do you think the WF influence has over them dark forces within governments? Also, one thing Liam mentioned, I totally believe what you mentioned about the lack of housing having an effect on infertility. But I would draw your attention to the last 30 or 40 years, the toxic chemicals we've actually sprayed on crops, which has a massive effect on fertility as well as dementia and other degenerative diseases. Comments, please.
Thank you. Just behind you, and the final one. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I am a property owner and I rent out properties. I have 3 children, 2 of which are at secondary school. We do all-inclusive accommodation. So we've seen a lot of things over the last and lived a lot of things as a small business, as working with tenants who are really struggling. My children who've been vilified at school because I refuse to let them wear masks, just all sorts of stuff. So we've really lived this sort of lockdown and this period and the financial side with having a small business. But one of the things that's really worrying me is the apathy that I see with people of just accepting the situation. Friends, family, like people have said already, what can we do about it? So I think it'd be useful to get some ideas on that, obviously together, declaration, us for them, and things like that exist. But what can we do in our local communities, with local councillors, with local MPs? How can we push it that way? How can we spread it out like a lily pad effect? And it was almost like a masterclass of marketing, the whole COVID, pandemic and how that was managed. Maybe some of those ideas we can use and turn on their head.
All right, thank you. And then at the very back.
Thank you. So I'm Jenny Johnson, and I'm an academic, a doctor, and I've worked with thinking about authoritarianism. And you are an amazing group of people in together, I think, to come together with such disparate views and sitting on a stage and being polite and discussing things. That's hard, and you are to be commended and be able to do that. It's not easy. My question/comment is, how can we stop authoritarian global creep in the West? So we've got Canada, we've got New Zealand, countries that we could never have believed would do what they have done to their people, actually stopping people from leaving their own nation because of the lack of vaccine, for instance. We've seen what's happened with them in the streets and how they've treated people. But also on the tech side as well, Facebook, Twitter, stopping normal, honest debate and speech. They've just stopped 330,000 people speaking on people who've been vaccine injured. Why is this, and where's it coming from? So I'm very interested in hearing from you guys about this authoritarian creep. And yes, World Economic Forum, I think, are at the centre of so much of this.
Okay, so you're good. So I'm going to ask you to do this in 1 minute. It's an impossible task, a response. At the end of that, I'm going to say something. Just before we do that, if you're a member of Together, can you put your hand up, please? All those that are members. Okay, right, good. I'm going to come back. We're going to say a final couple of words at the end of this. This has been a fantastic panel, but we're going to go first with Liam. 1 minute, Liam. I'm under pressure to finish up and wrap up. We're going to carry on after for drinks if people want to join us.
No problem. I'm going to use up some of my minute by saying I'm a guest of Together here, and thanks for having me. I've really appreciated being part of this discussion. I apologise again for pissing about on my phone. It's what I do for a living. It's pathetic, I know, but I might get a real job one day. I wanted to come back on Luke. I mean, when I am Chancellor, Luke, because clearly it's only a matter of time, I would implement a policy similar to the one that you talked about. I think raising the threshold of basic rate tax, taking more people out of tax, rather than taking money off them if they earn 11 grand a year, then putting them through an administrative rigmarole that employs loads of people, drones in the state to give them back benefits, maybe. It's completely ridiculous waste of money. So I would raise the basic rate of tax threshold to somewhere like £20,000. There are a couple of parties actually who do advocate that. One is Reform, run by a guy called Richard Tice, who's a former MEP, who's not everyone's cup of tea, but he's a very effective campaigner. And in my experience, he's a very good debater and catalyst of debate. And the second party is what remains of the SDP, which columnists like Rod Liddle have joined. I think Claire knows quite a lot of people in the SDP. And the other thing I was going to say, there's so much I could come back on, but I wanted to just applaud Michael's contribution as a musician and a historian. A wonderful contribution, I thought, of real quality and insight. When I wrote my last book on housing, when you're researching a book, it's really hard not to disappear down rabbit holes that are really interesting. And one of the rabbit holes I almost disappeared down, spending days reading about Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement. My final point, Alan, the reason the Garden City movement was able to create garden cities that gave working class people hope and life-changing accommodation amidst beautiful infrastructure and neighborhoods and a sense of place is because when the land was sold, the uplift on the land was shared between the landowner and the developers of the garden cities. That also is what happened with the new towns. What we do now, we don't share that planning gain at all. There's a couple of grubby things called the Section 106 and the Community Infrastructure Levy. The big house builders always negotiate them away, so you end up with box executive homes built in the middle of fields with barely any pavements. That is a major problem. We can learn a huge amount from Ebenezer Howard, but we need to change primary legislation to do it and face down the big property vested interests.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your
You can clap at the end. Don't clap everyone individually. We haven't got time. I'm under pressure. Molly.
That was only a minute.
I'm going to do 30 seconds on two things. The first is the trend towards increasing digitization, particularly in schools. I think it's really invidious. I think it's something that we need to try and combat. I think it's very hard when you have schools rolling out technology to children to push back on it, but it has to be done. Put a marker down. And the second thing is authoritarianism. I can't even say it. I think the way to stop it is you just put forward this group of people that's going to pop out of somewhere, puts forward a competing vision and just writes a manifesto that people can get behind. Like we've seen Giorgia Meloni, I don't agree with everything she said, but we've seen how effective that can be in Italy. And I think we need something similar here and we just have to fucking do it. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear because no one else is going to.
Right. Rupert?
Well, I'd just like to pick up on your comments about Germany and Japan. I don't know if everybody knows about the Marshall Plan, but largely they were actually reconstructed as a result of the Marshall Plan, which was a British and American attempt to stop the French making the same mistakes they made after the First World War. They were busy smashing up the German coal and steel industry. And the Marshall Plan, curiously enough, the EU came from the European Coal and Steel Community originally, which was the actual body from which it morphed. So I think a lot of the reconstruction of Japan and Germany was out of necessity. For the Americans, they wanted a market for their goods. They had surpluses everywhere, whereas they've got deficits everywhere now. So I think from everybody's point of view, I think the message is people have got to stand up for themselves. And this is, as I say, doesn't matter whether it's us. I'm 65 at the end of the month, so I'm a sort of a bit of a has-been. But I watch the young people, as you say. I don't see young people challenging. I don't see young people asking why the older generation are doing selfish things and stealing their opportunity, which is what's happening. The baby boomers, those selfish people who made all the money and enjoyed all the peace. And I honestly, I'm a tail end baby boomer, but I feel for the young people. What I can't say, what I know is that what Liz Truss and Kwarteng are trying to do is the right thing. Smaller straight, supply side reforms. Whether it will work, I don't know. Throughout my career, central planners have been intervening, whether it was propping up the clearing banks in the 70s, whether it was after 87 when the market collapsed and Greenspan intervened, long-term capital management, more central planning. It's just got worse and worse to the extent that unless the individual stands up, what I do know is that good societies are based on freedom and they're based on the individual. They are not based on statism.
Thank you. Thank you. Claire.
First of all, I like insecticide sprayed on my crops because maybe it's because I'm from an Irish peasant background and my mother has made it very clear to me that the glamour of poverty with no intervention into the food that we make, like modernity and science, isn't a good thing. Do you know what I mean? If you want to drink unpasteurized milk, no insecticides allowed, no. So I say that because I think there's an awful lot of confusion about what it is we've been through, and that's why I made the point about pharmacological interventions, right? But we should be able to have these discussions out. I agree with that. These are the kind of discussions that we need to have out. So I'm happy to have those debates. And debates in that sense, and not just, although I love intellectual life, and Alan started off with the history of this building and the whole idea of the battle of ideas is that we have discussions, and I know that I think Rosie's here who runs the Birmingham salon, and they actually meet here regularly and have events. She did have a fantastic event on globalism planned for on Saturday, but she can't have it because of the strike. She's also then chairing a debate on the trade unions at the Battle of Ideas, so you couldn't make it up. But we must do this. We must get together in whatever capacity and have these discussions. But it's not just about freeing our minds and having open debate, because we made it seem as though the problem is whether the state organises society or whether the market organises society. But what I really think I'm advocating is that we come together and create the ideas and intervene so that we know what we're doing, right? So we're having these discussions. I mean, you want to know how to organise a care service? I mean, go and talk to people who work in care, right? The care workers and the people who've got people in care. You want to know how to develop a particular area industrially, find out what skills they've got, what skills they lack, what kind of experience people have in the local areas. That's where historically change has occurred from. So in that sense, I believe in free speech and ideas per se, but actually there's a practical outcome of it. And the WEF, the World Economic Forum, it's just like, so the idea that they're getting credit for anything is such a joke. They are basically an NGO who claim that they are mapping out what's happening. They aren't, right? The authoritarian trends that we are seeing internationally are not the responsibility of a WEF plan. They're the responsibility of those of us historically who have fought for freedom and free speech, not winning the arguments with our fellow citizens, having been complacent and careless about freedom. There has not been a fight for freedom in this country for so long that when authoritarian trends emerge, nobody knew what to say. And then you say, oh, well, it's not our fault, it's those buggers up there who've imposed it on us. We can't blame anyone but ourselves. I take responsibility for the attacks on freedom in this country, and I take responsibility for fighting for freedom in this country. No one else is to blame. They might have a plan, but this lot could not organise.
Go on. Go on. Go on.
Getting drunk in a brewery. And
Great.
I trust our organisational skills, not their wishful thinking, and we shouldn't fuel their narcissism by pretending that they've got any control over it. They haven't.
Firstly, can we thank the panel, please? Just really... I just want to say thank you to Robert and the team and the Bruce Group.
Battle of Ideas,
Calm down. If you'd have told me a few years ago, like 20 years ago, I might have been speaking on a panel at the Bruce Group, I might have said that you were like slightly balmy, because I might not have aligned in many ways with that. I think what's so interesting and what's so important now about what's happening is that all of those old boundaries and parameters are changing and shifting, and what's really exciting is an opportunity for new, and where the real, without trying to sound new agey, this is really the point about human agency. it's a bit like the moment where you say, like, where here I stand, I can do no other, right? If anyone's familiar with that, it's like, it's going to be up to us. If you want to know what the future's going to look like, or even what we're going to do now, it's going to be up to you and us. And I think that's the thing at Together. We've come with people with lots of different views and a lot of different things, but the central tenets, our pillars, what we say are our pillars, are about free speech, about choice and privacy and autonomy, and about the public having a voice, that we're not all stupid COVIDiots or gammons or any of those terms, right? Those nasty ideas about ordinary people, but we're our fellow citizens. We're the people that have made history, that have shaped it, that have been part of these great cities and industrialization and the transformation. And we can make that happen all over again, but it's going to be up to us to do that. It's going to be up to us to put pressure on those elected representatives. It's going to be up to us to organise locally, like Danny and some of the other guys are doing here, which we'd really encourage you to do locally, to be ambassadors with Together, to become a member, to advocate others. On the WEF, we get so many comments about it and everything that I've been rereading The Great Reset and The Great Narrative in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, just because we've got an event on it. And I really do want to thrash these things out, because I think a lot of the time when people say it's all just a plan and it's all just there, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's actually against agency, because the idea is there's nothing we can do about it. So let's make a reset of our own kind, right? Let's have a reset that ordinary people can actually shape and curate the world. We've demonstrated we can change some things already with the mandate and with others. We can challenge the online safety bill. We can push that back. We can be about free speech. We can encourage the new kind of culture that we want to see. It's not next week, it's on the 15th and the 16th. Together we'll be at the Battle of Ideas. We'd encourage all of you to come down to it. It's a really, really big and important and exciting, inspiring event. And then on the 24th, we're going to be in London. I want to thank the venue. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Paul and Anna for the broadcast. And stay around afterwards. Let's carry on the debate and discussion. And I think that both at the Labour Party conference and the Tory Party conference, we've seen that what's really lacking is a sense of conviction and commitment and belief, right? And passion. And I would say that really, and that's not a great thing. I think that's a problem. But I think we can begin to sort of be that alternative and say, look, if you want to actually get involved in doing something and having a say, this is where it can start. And recently our AGM, the members said that we should do something which is actually to get out a bit more and have something that takes a shape a bit more like what Molly was talking about. So it's early days, but if you want to be involved in that, we'd encourage you to. And in the end, let's not look around anywhere else. Let's get our friends, our colleagues, our neighbours, the people that we like up and down. Let's have those discussions and get them involved. We need to get out of our bubble, right? Just remember how many people voted around Brexit or Remain. We're nowhere near anything like that. Let's not kid ourselves. And the only way, if you're convinced of your idea, the only way it has merit and virtue is if you can win someone else over to it. So let's do that in the spirit. Let's come together. We're stronger together. Thank you very much, everyone.